my introduction. Oh,
Sorry, Tricia.
that's okay. Can you save me not to go first for the first 5-10 minute intro?
Yeah.
I just wasn't aware we were going to do that.
Yeah, that's fine. No worries. Yeah, we can start. We can go to. I think we're live now. Okay, so we're 3:01 my time out here in New Brunswick. So I'm just gonna wait for about 30 more seconds, and if that's okay, and then Natasha, you can get us going.
That sounds great. I feel like we're all actually in very different time zones right now. This is gonna
We are, yeah.
ending.
All right, go ahead, Natasha. Well, great timing right when you're about to take a sip.
Nope, it's perfect. Let's get started. So my name's Natasha Darshi, and of course, I think that you have seen our panel series being started all over our social media channels. So this is the first of many. Carla, thanks for the beautiful shout out. We're excited to have you here. And so we're starting our first panel off here from local to global. We're really excited to host this panel series. This is one of 4 panels that we'll be having, and I'm going to just throw it straight to you, Addie, to introduce yourself and our other panel members today and what we're going to be chatting about.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks so much for that, Natasha. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our global MRH audience. My name's Addie, and I'm an alumnus of the 2014 March of Remembrance and Hope. I'm so pleased to be moderating this conversation today, and I want to start by thanking Jason, Natasha, and our incredible, indefatigable Carla, who we all know and love, for asking me to do this. I'm coming to you from the stolen lands of the Wastaquet, Passamaquoddy, and Mi'kmaq peoples in what is now known as Fredericton, New Brunswick, here in Canada. I've also had the privilege to live on the territories of the Algonquin, the Anishinaabe peoples in what is now known as Ottawa, as well as on Treaty 1, Treaty 6, and Treaty 7 territories out west. I want to express my gratitude to the original stewards of these lands and pledge as a settler who benefits from the colonization of these lands to commit myself to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The format of today's event is going to be quite straightforward. We're going to begin with remarks from each of the panelists, and we'll then go on to a question and answer round where we will be able to have a fruitful discussion, I'm sure, about the incredible work that our panelists are doing. So we're going to start with Rachel Barsky, an alumna of MRH 2006, who is a lawyer with Narwhal Litigation and a volunteer case reviewer for Innocence Canada. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Eddie. So so I'm one of the earlier alumni of MRH, it seems, and it is something that, you know, it was an experience that really has stuck with me since 2006. I was early in my undergrad, and it really, I don't know if it has changed the trajectory of me going to law school, but it certainly, I think, made me a much better lawyer than I would have been otherwise. And I think it has helped me focus into more human rights issues, more social justice issues. So I just, for background, most of my career has actually focused on one single gigantic case, which is called Tallio, T-A-L-L-I-O. And it's the case of this man, Philip Tallio, who is an Indigenous man from the First Nation of Bella Coola, the New Hulk First Nation. And Bella Coola is a very, very isolated, very remote community in northern British Columbia. So Philip was 17 at the time of the incident occurred. This was in April of 1983. And he was then 17. He was ward of the state. He was in foster care, had gone through the foster care system, has a very, very sad, very tragic backstory. And he was he was asked to go check on his then 2-year-old cousin, and he went to check on her, and he maintains that he did not commit this offense, but he found his 2-year-old cousin deceased, and she had been sexually assaulted. So it's a very, very sad, could not be more sad of a case. And there was really no RCMP investigation done into that offense. He was taken in, and it's a very, very long story that you can read about on the internet. There's a lot of articles about it, but he was sent to prison. And he was, it's now been over 38 years, and I'm working on the case to hopefully have him exonerated. So I work on cases where people maintain to be innocent, factually innocent, of crimes, many of them historical. And then so I reviewed this case, and I found that there was merit to this. I thought there was something very wrong with what happened. And then I have a background in journalism, so I actually ended up reinvestigating the whole case, which was pretty difficult, having been so many years later. By the time I started working on it, that was in April of 2011. So that was already about 30 years after the fact. So it's been a very, very intense and complicated case and story. And from, directly from MRH, I think that, there's so many things that I think have stayed with me from MRH that have then, influenced my work on this particular case. And one of them really being on MRH, when I went, there were actually very few Jewish participants. So I was one of very few in my group. So I grew up Jewish in Calgary, where it was, it definitely did experience some anti-Semitism, and especially because there have been a number of people growing up and since that did not believe that I, looked Jewish, and did not. So a lot of things were said in my presence, where then they said, "Oh, well, you're not Jewish," and they didn't believe me. So I had definitely experienced that, and even in high school. So when I got to MRH and I saw how all of these participants had, applied to be in this program who weren't even Jewish and really wanted to learn about the Holocaust, about genocide issues, it really, really meant a great deal to me to watch other people from other backgrounds really want to, participate in that, and to understand what happened and how do we, stop more of these events from happening. And that really meant a lot, having grown up with people who, some of whom were really not interested or really were perpetuating stereotypes and so on. So it really meant a lot. And that for me, as an outsider to the Indigenous community, in which I do a lot of my work, surrounding Talio, for example, I've constantly asked myself, well, am I the right person to be involved with this? Can I go go into this community as an outsider? How do you gain the trust of people who I've had to interview them about extremely sensitive topics, and I constantly ask myself, well, how am I the right person? What can I do as an outsider? And that has already it's always brought me back to the MRH experience. For me, I just so appreciated seeing people outside of the the Jewish faith, the Jewish religion or ethnicity, culture, who are then wanting to help in some way. And so that for me has been a real touchstone in my work, and trying to hopefully be a good ally. So for me, it kind of goes back to MRH and how do you be a good ally, amongst many other things that I experienced from MRH.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's just such an inspiring story, especially the impact that MRH has had on your career and your own stories growing up in Calgary. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's a particularly salient time right now, I think, to be talking about these issues as we are seeing a resurgence of a lot of extremism targeting people of different faiths and targeting Jewish people in particular, targeting Muslims and people of color. And so thank you so much for sharing that story. We're going to go next to Mallory. Mallory Mroz-Kleedorfer, who is an alumna of MRH 2009. And Mallory is going to take us to the global stage as a political analyst with the International Criminal Court in Vienna. So over to you, Mallory.
Yes, thank you so much. Exactly, I'm currently based in Vienna, Austria. That's more due to the circumstances of Corona and family situation. But otherwise, I am working with the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Netherlands. Prior to this position, I've worked with various UN agencies, including UN Refugee Agency at the Sudanese border in Ethiopia, where, well, actually, I should start at the other side. I should say I started in Ottawa as a student in Canada, where I was studying political science and working with an all-party parliamentary group for the prevention of genocide and crimes against humanity. So this was working on Canada's perspective in what is our role in preventing mass human rights abuses internationally. And that was the focus, of course, not to say there aren't any in our own backyard. And then from there, I moved on to the UN agencies briefly with the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations, which of course is trying to prevent human rights violations from occurring in a practical sense, but also with UN Women in Cambodia. That was a particularly interesting assignment because it really came about a year or two after MRH. So the experience of MRH was still quite fresh. And I remember starting to have this light bulb click on of how human rights violations affect men and women differently. And people have different experiences. Sometimes it's the same violation, sexual abuse, for example, or rape, but how people have different understandings of what has happened to them, have different ways of coping and different levels of support to overcome what has happened with them, to overcome this type of trauma. I've also worked with the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, and that was actually a joint office with the responsibility to protect. So again, looking at the global level, but focusing on non-discrimination. What is the long-term fight against genocide? In the MRH experience, we learned about that genocide has not just been in the gas chambers, that's the final stage. We've seen acts of genocide, or what could amount to, or what could lead to genocide, is actually starting with words, starting with discrimination, starting with symbols, and that is oftentimes institutionalized in different states. So looking at that at the local, in terms of the global policy level, but how that can be applied in different governments or by different governments around the world. And then finally, sorry, I should have done this the other way around, with UNHCR, working with the UN Refugee Agency. This is where I'm working with refugees who fled. Sometimes it's generalized violence, sometimes it's persecution based on ethnic, national, religious grounds, or whatever the case may be. Sometimes there's overlapping issues or categories. And we are, in UNHCR in particular, applies for international legal frameworks from the Refugee Convention, for example, to individual cases of asylum seekers. So how does this person qualify? Should this person qualify to be a refugee? And at the same time, we need to protect the institution of asylum and looking if there's exclusion criteria. Is it possible that this person may have actually committed acts that could exclude them, such as acts of human rights violations or assisted in armed conflict in some way? And of course, it's never so straightforward, because what if the person was a child soldier? And what if the individual before you was forced to do this? And what if now they have 6 children who should benefit from the legal protection, but the father actually might not or should not benefit from these international frameworks? So some very challenging questions, often in some remote locations. And it was actually the MRH experience that got me through some of the harder times, that remembering that despite the frustrations, despite the personal sacrifices and the times where you really feel like you're not going anywhere, you're not making any progress. I mean, I thought cases were taking years, but I hear the story from Rachel of was it 10 years for this one case?
And we're
it takes time. Still waiting. And at the same time, you have somebody in front of you who needs answers, who's expecting answers, and whose life is very much stuck on this one point, and they cannot move forward until they have answers. So it's MRH's experience that reminds you that this is the cause worth fighting for. And despite the hardships, it's worth it. Now I'm with the International Criminal Court, which is, of course, which is the permanent court, focusing on prosecution, sorry, of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression. And I'm currently looking at situations of Côte d'Ivoire and Mali, where it's the same frustrations as what we see here in Canada. I remember speaking with women's associations in Mali and back in March 2018. And the women saying to me, we would really like justice to be served. It would be so timely to have reparations in the holy month of Ramadan. And I thought, but isn't that in June? And like, yes, it's in June. It's just in a few months. And oh, it's not going to be in June 2018. And knowing the realities on the ground and being the one to deliver the message of trying to manage expectations of if and when justice will be served. And that was actually quite a quick case, because the accused had pled guilty. So it went smoothly, and reparations were issued in March of this year, 3 years later, but still quite swift for this type of trial. So that's a bit of a summary of what I've done in since doing the MRH experience. And I would say it definitely wasn't career changing for me, but rather affirming that this is the path that I want to be on. One of my old bosses, when I worked at Parliament, Senator Romeo Dallaire used to say that once you know, you can't unknow. And that's exactly it. Once you've seen the gas chambers, once you've heard Pinhas's story of his twin sister, you're somehow bound to this, and maybe in different ways, shapes, or forms, but it's just always present in our daily lives.
Well, Mallory, that's just incredible. I mean, what a journey, and the work that you're doing is so important on the global stage. And I like what you said about MRH and how it got you through some harder times. And I think the way you put it, essentially, that despite frustrations and despite hardships, MRH teaches you that it's worth it to keep going and keep fighting. And I think that's one of the that's one of the reasons why it's called the March of Remembrance and Hope, right? Where would we be if we didn't have hope? So thank you for that, Mallory. We're gonna go now to Tricia to tell us a little bit about what she's been working on. Trisha Cowie is an alumna of the 2003 MRH trip and is the founder and owner of Cowie Law Professional Corporation and a member of the Hiawatha First Nation. So over to you, Trisha.
Thank you, Adi. So it's a pleasure to be here today MRH has impacted my life forever. And I often reflect on my experience with the March of Remembrance and Hope. When I joined in 2003, I was in university. It may have been my first or second year. I was enrolled in the political science and Aboriginal studies at University of Toronto. I was already determined to become a lawyer. My fuel to become a lawyer stemmed from wanting to change and find social justice for vulnerable groups, in particular Indigenous groups, and in my case, First Nation groups, and dealing with those legal issues. So I've always been passionate about challenging bigotry and racism. And somehow I found a space in the MRH program, which really was just like a slingshot that just kind of like, ding, there you go. And this is what's pushing me to do more, because the lessons, like with MRH and learning about the lessons of the Holocaust, standing up against bigotry and hate and racism, knowing where intolerance of other cultures can lead to, that's what that program was about. And we can take those lessons and we can apply it here in Canada. When we look at how Canada and Canadians have treated Indigenous people, the first peoples of this country, we can apply a lot of those lessons. And that's really where I've shaped my career, and a lot of my volunteer work and a lot of my passion is based out of that. And so when I became a lawyer, I first started working at a law firm that deals strictly in First Nation legal issues. And I was lucky enough to participate on a very small level because the lawyers who have been carrying the torch on this are just incredible. But on a very small level, I got to contribute and see and be part of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal challenge for Indigenous children in the child welfare system. So some of you may know of Cindy Blackstock. She has been a tireless advocate for Indigenous children in the welfare system, and being part of that legal process and watching in court people challenge the way Canada has treated Indigenous children. Because essentially what that case was about was that Canada is underfunding child welfare on reserve. And that is discrimination because it's leading to all of this harm. So where our children have already suffered decades, hundreds of years of colonization, and have suffered under that umbrella, they probably need more resources, not less resources, to be able to stay with their family and learn their culture and their language. But instead, Canadian government horribly underfunded child welfare. And it's not only in that area, it's also in the area of policing, of housing, of water and sewer. The list goes on. And the reason for that underfunding is strictly because they could. They're First Nations on reserve, and we're underfunding you for that purpose, and we can get away with it. And it's put First Nations, Métis and Inuit as well, at a huge disadvantage. And it can be seen as one of the systems that's in place of the ongoing genocide in Canada. We have to be able to get past this kind of internal and structural discrimination and racism. It's in there, it's insidious, and it's very hard to detect. But more and more, these cases are coming to the forefront, and they're not going away. So we need to be proactive in dealing with it. And so that's where I got my footing as a young lawyer. I eventually moved on, and I opened up my own firm in a small town where I live. And a few years in, I was approached to run in politics. So I was a federal candidate in the 2015 and the 2019 federal elections. And really, again, the fuel for the fire there is, I'm an Indigenous representative, and that voice has to be at the table. There's no way around it. There needs to be somebody constantly saying to political leaders and to Canadians, we have to implement the calls to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have to implement the calls to action from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. We have things to do, and we can't let it fall to the wayside. And that's what continues to happen. We're losing, there aren't, and I have to be careful here because there's so many politicians, like there's so many people, the Canadians, politicians, representatives who care, but it keeps falling to the wayside. And we know better. We have the reports. We know about the ongoing injustices. We know what happened in the past, and we know what's continuing to happen, and we know how to fix it. So my job now, and a lot of where I see myself going in the future, is to make sure that that knowledge is out there, and the political willpower and the willpower among Canadians stays at a level high enough to continue to get stuff done. Because we're not talking about everything being fixed, in the next 4 years. This is generational. We need governments at all levels. We need Canadians for the next several generations to be on board with making these changes the new foundation for Canadian life and Indigenous life. And we have the solutions, and I really want people to be motivated to implement them and to share that they want this action to happen. And the note that I'll end on is the project I'm currently working on is with regard to the horrifying headline that 215 Indigenous children were found buried in unmarked grave at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And it took that horrifying headline for Canadians to wake up again and say, do something. But the shameful truth is that we already knew that that was a truth. And if you didn't know, then I would urge you to pay more attention. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report disclosed this. We knew that there were unmarked graves. We knew how to fix it. We knew the things that we needed to do to consult with Indigenous communities to honor their wishes and what they want done with the remains of their family. And it just wasn't done. And nothing can be done fast enough, but the effort has to be there, and Canadians can't wait for the next headline to do something. And so we started a sign campaign, me and a group of local volunteers who care about what happened and want something done about it. So on June 21st, which is National Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada, we're going to host a memorial honoring ceremony for the 215 children. And we've created signs to represent each one of those 215 children. And on the back of those signs, there will be a fact about residential schools. And the signs will be placed at Memorial Park, where I live, for people to take time and reflect and hopefully learn, and then be encouraged to reach out and contact their representatives and beg them, please do something. We have to make more effort on moving forward on the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Thank you,
Tricia. What a powerful note to end your remarks on. I think the sign campaign sounds just incredibly powerful, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it happen and seeing what sort of response you get from your local leaders. Your point about making sure that it's important to have voices at the table to call on our leaders to implement the calls to action is so well taken, and it's so timely. And so thanks so much for sharing that, and thanks for all the great work you do in advancing this important cause. As we continue this event. We're gonna move on into Q&A, but before we do, I do want to ask folks to ask you folks to reflect a little bit more on the links between MRH and your work today, and you've all touched on it a little bit. But I think certainly the attendees are an audience certainly with an interest in MRH, and so I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about delve a little bit deeper into the impact that MRH has had on your careers. And I think Jason and I were talking about this a few weeks ago when we were talking about this event, and he put it very well. He said, for some, it's been a turning point in their lives, causing them to shift their focus dramatically or change careers entirely. And for others, it's been a guiding force in the background as they continue their careers. And so the question is, I suppose, which is it for you? And I know some of you already touched on this a little bit, but I think it'd be really great to hear a little bit more about your reflections. So whoever wants to go first, you can either unmute yourself and start talking, or raise your hand and I'll call on you.
I'll start.
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, no, just in terms, and the one thing I do want to reflect on is relatively immediate, because, and I meant to mention this in my introduction as well, but in listening to Mallory and Rachel, I couldn't help but think of when during MRH, we had just arrived in Poland, and there was a guest speaker series in the very beginning, and they were there to offer insights and kind of talk about the academics behind the Holocaust. And one of the survivors, I remember he got up there and his thesis was that, they were morally bankrupt. And that's how we got to the Holocaust, which is a very strong statement to make. And then there was also the comment that, all it takes is for good people to do nothing. And then as I'm sitting here with this panel, I'm like, these are people who are trying to do the moral and just thing. That there's no moral bankruptcy here. We're following that radar that each of us has as best we can. And not to say that it's, the be all end all and we're absolutely right, but none of us on this panel are willing to sit by and do nothing about it. And for me, that's what I'm hearing. That's the common thread that I've heard in listening to these other women speak. And that really brought me back to that moment in Poland and listening to those speeches about how did the Holocaust happen and where did it start? And so as long as we have people such as yourselves doing something, then there's always hope for a better future.
Thanks, Tricia. That's a very inspiring note. Rachel, Mallory, Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, it really is a very powerful, expression, Tricia, and the same to you. I mean, it's I think once, as you've both said, once you've been that proximate, especially getting to know survivors, getting to know people who are in these situations, I don't know how you can separate yourself from just standing by. And part of I think how we have, how people can get more involved is by making things more proximate to them. So getting to know people who are refugee, who have gone through these experiences, and so telling your own story can be very powerful in encouraging other people to get involved. So so for me, as I said, I was already interested in going to law school, among a lot of other things. I have many scattered interests in a lot of ways, but when I went to MRH, it was already in my head, but I did not actually plan to go into criminal law at that time, and going more into social justice. I think going into more social justice, human rights issues, I do think directly correlates to the MRH experience. So as I said, I think I was probably already on that path of going to law school, but I think that MRH did influence the kind of work that I have been doing, just because I think when you've really gotten to know real people who are affected by these, often terrible, terrible, unimaginable experiences, how do you just let that go, and how do you turn away from that? It's I don't know. I just think that we all have a responsibility to try to do what we can, without hopefully burning yourself out too much, and that's a difficult balance in itself.
Yeah, that's probably definitely one of the biggest challenges for a lot of the folks that do the kind of work that you do, Rachel. Thanks for those reflections. Mallory, do you want to share yours with us?
Yes, what I was just thinking, think I'm the only one living outside of Canada right now, as a Canadian living in Vienna, and it's actually, these injustices are everywhere here. You walk outside 500 meters, there's this nice church courtyard where there's a farmer's market every week, and I always fall on this, they call it stumbling stones, and it's actually designed to be a memorial where you stumble across it, and it's this kind of ledge and the cobblestone pathway that's a clear glass window looking into all the keys of the people who are, I guess, the keys that were confiscated from the people who were evicted from their homes, the Jewish community who was evicted in this quarter from their homes in the 1930s. Hundreds of people were forced to leave. And I walk 500 meters in the other direction, and there's this huge old Nazi bunker that is impossible to tear down. The Austrians have tried, it just doesn't go. Somebody has written in graffiti, "Never again." And this is just part of my daily life. But actually, it's also part of our daily lives, even if we're not in Europe, if we are in Africa or in Canada. You just open your smartphone, click on your CBC app, and there are these headlines that Tricia has been talking about, which are, it's the same injustice is repeated over and over again. And actually, I think it was Tricia as well who mentioned that this will take generations to undo, to change the structures that are in place. And I just thought this Nazi bunker that's been there since, I don't know, whatever year in the 1930s or 40s is actually exactly that. It's taken generations, and yet it's still physically there. It's this still constant reminder that more needs to be done.
Thank you, Mallory. Yeah, that's you are very much living in a historical city in many ways, but that is those stumbling stones must be couldn't be more direct a link to our MRH experiences, and it's quite something to behold. Thank you for sharing those reflections. Before we open up the Q&A to the folks joining us as audience members, I'm hoping we can just delve a little bit into some of the work that you've been doing, and I have one question for each of you about the work you're doing, and then we can open up the floor. Mallory, if you don't mind, I'll start with you again, just ask you, you are working on the international stage, trying to hold perpetrators of injustice to account. It's a career path that couldn't be, any closer really to one of MRH's central themes, justice and accountability. So the question I have for you is how are we doing in your view as a global community in holding perpetrators of injustices to account on these international stages? Simple question.
Yes, a simple question for, I think, the only person who's not a lawyer on the panel. So I'd invite the other colleagues to speak on this as well if they wish. But in my view, I think significant progress has been made in the last half century. That maybe even this progress has been accelerated in the last 25 years. There have been specialized criminal tribunals established for the situations in Cambodia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Kosovo, the list goes on. And now there's a permanent court in The Hague for exactly this purpose, to try to promote international justice for cases of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. 60, 70 years ago, that was unimaginable. But the fact that more than 130 state parties have signed the Rome Statute and said this is an important part of our work, and they're willing to take on the obligations of what that means of preventing and prosecuting genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So this is already significant progress. We've alluded to at the beginning, the challenge remains, I think, especially from the victim's perspective, the length of time that it takes for justice to be served. That people have different cultures, have different understandings of what justice would be, that in some cultures, I mentioned Mali earlier on, where people would prefer to discuss, and maybe even in Indigenous cultures in Canada, you may have this as well, where there's more of a community circle, elders might come together, discuss the situation, resolve it communally, and then turn the page and move on. Where you then have this international court that comes and justice will be served according to this perspective, and it might take 10 years, and we're going to look at the evidence and analyze the details, and it's a completely different concept of what justice is for some of the victim communities. So it's a challenge as well as trying to reconcile what is justice for the international community and what is justice at the local level for those who've experienced the injustices themselves. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. I mean, those are some very interesting questions you have to grapple with at the global level. And I mean, it's the scale of these decisions that have to be made in your office. I think, just simply boggles my mind. The far-reaching impacts of those decisions and the hundreds of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of lives that are impacted by those decisions. So, thank you for sharing those reflections. I would be remiss though, Mallory, if I didn't ask a follow-up, and I assume you can't talk about this. So if you can't, just say that you can't, and that's fine. But there has been a call on the ICC to investigate the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada. There was a recent letter signed by many lawyers calling on the court to do that. And I wonder if that's something you can or can't talk about. And if you can't, that's fine. We'll move on.
I can't comment on that one at all, not because of any organizational restriction, just because it's outside of my area of expertise.
That's fair enough.
I'm based in the registry, which of course is a neutral organ, which is part of the secretariat, and not part of the prosecution team, which would look at whether the situation would fall under preliminary examination. They would conduct preliminary examination to see whether the situation even falls within ICC jurisdiction before moving on to full investigations. And that process can already take years. So I have no clue what it would be like for if this were to come. Sorry.
No, that's all good.
Excellent question. And I'm very curious how it would.
Thanks, Mallory. So Rachel, if you don't mind, I'll go to you next. One of the things that MRH was about in terms of human rights was really also the right to liberty, and it's of course one of the most sacrosanct rights in our justice system. And despite that, our approach to justice is very much carceral, and it's very much predicated on the deprivation of liberty. And as you're fighting for your client's exoneration, and as we sort of grapple in society with some broader conversations about abolishing police, abolishing prisons, and really reimagining the way we think about justice, what are some of your reflections on this carceral approach to justice, and is it time, in your view, to re-examine this approach?
So it's very good, very, very big question. So certainly there are aspects that we need to re-examine. So there, and I'll just stipulate it by saying there are some people who do pose serious risk and serious danger to society who should be separated from society. And then there are, I mean, there's many inmates in federal prison I've done some work in prison policy. There are many inmates, about 30%, it's estimated by studies in federal prisons, who have disorders like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or other brain injuries. That gets into difficult questions where we have, like, they've committed a crime, but their criminality may be attributed to their disability, for example. So that, you start to ask, well, should they be incarcerated or should they be in an institution? Or if we know that that person has a disability that maybe prevents them from being rehabilitated, how does that factor in? That's something that the justice system has just kind of stayed away from even grappling with. And then there are many inmates who, other inmates who struggle with mental illness or addiction, and social attributions, who actually could be helped and rehabilitated, but they are quite unlikely to receive this help in prison, because what they're actually dealing with is a health issue rather than a justice system issue. So that's the area where I think we very much need reform. And even from a purely economic perspective, if you get rid of kind of the morality issues and you look at it just from an economic perspective, last time I checked, it's extremely competitive. It's extremely expensive to incarcerate someone. Last time I checked, it was more than $110,000 a year to incarcerate a male prisoner. And for women, it actually is double that number. So it's about $220,000 per year to incarcerate a female inmate each year. So you think about, well, and then we look at, well, we have, way overrepresentation of Indigenous inmates, of Indigenous people in prisons. And we look at, well, why are they really in prison? Are those resources, those very, a lot of resources, are those better spent assisting them in a medical and social context rather than, to prevent recidivism, even looking at it just from an economic perspective. So, and then there's some other issues where I ended up doing a very large report. If anyone really feels like nerding out, there's a report that I did about the issue of parole and innocence. It's called Preventing Parole, and it's online. You can access it on Canly. And that deals with looking at violence risk assessment. So there are, what if there are inmates who do not actually pose a high risk of violence to the public? They, some actually pose a low risk of violence, but society's feelings towards them with regards to wanting to continuously punish them for their acts, which I think, it's something that is also an issue in MRH, like looking at, well, when we deal with people like Nazis, like, people who committed horrendous acts, of course there is a human desire to punish them, and so that gets into some very complex ethical issues also. So it's an issue that has many factors to it. I do think that the criminal justice system, players in that are waking up to the fact that some of the issues that are put on the criminal justice system and on policing are actually better, more of a health issue, more of a mental health issue, and addictions. I think people are waking up to that. There is some movement on it, at least in Vancouver, but it's definitely a struggle. It's something that has done. We've made some progress with, but not. That's an area where I'd say we do need a lot of progress on.
Thanks, Rachel. The dollar figures alone that you talked about in terms of how much it just costs us to keep the system going is mind blowing in itself. If we just put that money towards housing somebody or providing social supports upstream, we could really avoid so many of these incarcerations at the the downstream level. So I think those are very important reflections, Rachel. Thank you. Tricia, before we go to Tricia with the question we have for you, I just want to flag for folks who are wondering how long we're going to go for. We plan to do 1 hour and 15 minutes. So we have about, what's 10 plus 15, 25 minutes left, I think. And I will we'll hopefully have time for, I think, a couple of questions. And so, I'm really looking forward to that. I see there's one question already, but folks, feel free to send in your questions while this continues. So Tricia, I wanted to go back to something you said. We know that MRH obviously is very much about education of the horrors of genocide and our commitment to prevent it from happening again. You've touched on the fact that these past few weeks we've been having a renewed conversation about genocide education and reconciliation, particularly in the wake of the discovery of the bodies of 215 children in Kamloops. But as you pointed out, so many Canadians are unfamiliar with our own country's history of genocide. We like to tell ourselves lies about the people who we call founders of Canada, and we tell ourselves lies about Canada being different from other colonial countries. So what are your reflections on what we need to do to really decolonize Canada, particularly those of us who are settlers and our responsibilities in that regard?
Sure. And the statement I want to make is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is, in my opinion, the most important Canadian report of our entire generation. That lays out the pathway for what we need to do if we want to decolonize, which I don't even know that I would use that phrase. If you want to create a just society, if you want to have a moral society, if you want to end the racism and the hatred against Indigenous peoples that are in Canada today, then you need to educate yourself, read the Truth and Reconciliation, understand what happened in the past, and that's still what continues today, right? And at this point, there is a very strong individual responsibility for you to do your own research, which, in my opinion, shouldn't be the case. We have a wonderful education system across Canada, but it is missing the reality of Canadian history as it relates to Indigenous peoples. We need to have education, and it needs to be age appropriate, because there is some heavy stuff in there, and it can be age appropriate, but we need the provinces who have control of education to get on board with starting that education in grade schools. We need it in high schools. When it comes to universities, providing universities the funding they need to create Indigenous-centric programs. These aren't like my ideas. This is all like, this is in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. This is part of the calls to action. And I can't bring enough attention to that document. We have a way to be better. We have a way to fix this problem. And the problem being the relationship, right? And the deterioration of that, and the continued deterioration of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And Indigenous communities and leaders have been advocating forever. Like, it's not like when the residential schools opened, our communities were there advocating, saying, this is a problem, we don't like this. It was completely ignored. It was completely lacked any support. We knew that these things were wrong as it was going on. And nothing was done about it. And there were reports. So if you look in the early 1900s, there were reports about the horrible conditions of residential schools. but it was ignored and it lacked support. We now today, we are literally repeating history. We have reports. We know about the horrible conditions that are affecting Indigenous communities today and what is being done about it. So it really comes down, it comes back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report for me every single time, Addie. I strongly encourage every single person to at least go through the calls to action. They're visionary. You know, I don't know when we stop developing the willpower to be able to do great things, but it feels like that's the case. And I absolutely refuse to believe that that's a Canadian way. We need to continue to work towards those goals, even if it's going to take generations to do so. But really, I would just encourage everyone to look at the TRC. We're talking education. We're talking about rehauling the child welfare system. You want to talk about a system that's in place now that continues to oppress Indigenous people? It's the child welfare system. It's the new residential system. There are more children in child welfare today, Indigenous children in child welfare today, than there were at the height of residential school systems. It is ongoing. Families continue to be torn apart and separated. We're talking about children losing their culture and their languages still. And it's systemized. So these systems that we see as protecting non-Indigenous kids are actually killing our children. We have to change it. We have a way forward. The TRC is so thoughtful and visionary, is really the way I would put it. And I would just strongly encourage everybody to look to that and to advocate for the implementation of those calls to action.
I think that's just great, Tricia. I mean, you know, you so clearly said, you know, at this point there's a very strong individual responsibility for folks to do our own research, and then you helpfully also point out the answers are already there, and they've been there for some time now, and the Truth and Reconciliation report lays it out in terms that could not be clearer. We know what needs to be done, and we need to do it without delay. So thank you, Tricia. We can go into Q&A from the floor now. I see there's one question, so I will ask that question out loud. But folks, please do send in any other questions you might have, and we still have these panelists with us for 15 more minutes. And so we can, you know, take as much as we can from them before they have to leave us. So the question is from Eva D'Souza. Thank you for your insight, stories, and inspiration. You all serve in the fields of law and politics. I'm wondering what advice you would give to those whose calling is not to work in those fields, but instead in fields such as healthcare, customer service, etc. So if anybody wants to take a stab at that first, either unmute yourself and speak, or raise your hand and I can call on you.
I'm happy to go.
Go ahead. Tricia, go ahead, and then we'll go to you, Mallory, and then Rachel.
There, okay. What immediately comes to mind is there was a young Indigenous woman named Joyce in Quebec who recorded nurses at the Quebec hospital saying absolutely reprehensible things to her, and she died in hospital. So you do not have to be in law to have these insights or this self-reflection. This is an instance in healthcare where we know there is continued discrimination and racism towards Indigenous people. And I'm sure it's not only Indigenous people, people of color in general. And I don't mean to exclude on that at all. But there's always, it doesn't matter. From my perspective, it doesn't seem to matter which industry you're in. There's always having that awareness of what's going on. And and the willingness to change whatever the problem is. Because I find the hardest problem to do in any field is to get the players at the top to recognize that there's even a problem. So people don't like to be told that something's going wrong. They don't want the bad press or whatever their reasoning is. But trying to get the problem recognized right off the hop is a massive undertaking in and of itself. But so that's immediately what came to mind, and I hope that provides some insight. But also, again, I'm just going to bring it back to the TRC. They also make healthcare recommendations on ways that we can overhaul that system as well. So I would encourage you to look at those calls to action as well.
Thank you, Tricia. Mallory, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, well, this panel was entitled Human Rights in Practice from Global to Local, but I think we could also add in at the personal level as well. And it actually doesn't matter what work you do, what your profession is. It's by simply reflecting on the MRH experience, on trying to think of how you can apply the concepts that you've learned of treating people with dignity and respect as just starting with you as the person who respects the basic human rights of other people. And it's also easy to think, okay, in the field of law or political science, you're really working on these legal frameworks that are in place and you're trying to change the system. But actually, when I was working in a refugee camp, it was the border of Ethiopia and Sudan, I felt very out of place. I felt like there was nothing I could do. There was nothing that I could offer. What refugees actually needed were teachers in the schools. They needed doctors in the healthcare system. They needed police officers to investigate the crimes that had been committed against them. They needed clerks who could sit at a desk and fairly distribute the food, measure out the food and distribute it according to the rations. They needed sanitation workers to promote the concepts of hygiene and sanitation for public health issues. All professions actually support basic human rights issues. And it's easy to kind of get caught up in the daily work and not actually lift your head up and say, wow, I am doing something for the cause. Even if it's not on changing the legal frameworks, it's putting the human rights in practice.
That's right. Thank you, Mallory. Rachel, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, and I mean the same. I have, you've already said it so well. You don't need to be in law or politics. I mean, I've had so many instances where, for example, I've been, was desperately trying to get healthcare for inmates in prison and could not, for the life of me, find a doctor who would go to visit this inmate. I mean, if someone is in the healthcare field or knows people in the healthcare field, that would have made, a life, a world of difference. But so you don't have to be in a certain industry to be able to affect change. It's really from so many areas. And I think, as Mallory was saying, just from a personal level, the quote that I always, I often think of is something to the extent of, everyone you meet is fighting a battle that you can't see. So, be kind. And that does play in my head a lot. There's a lot, that people are going through that you would have no idea, regardless of what background they're from. And I think that is something that plays a lot. And if that's one thing that you can do, regardless of the level of influence that you might have, or you think that you might have, because of your particular job or not, that's something that we all can do.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's these are fights we are carrying through all of our different professions and lives, regardless of what we're doing, and certainly doesn't need to be limited to the field of law. But Tricia, do you have something to add?
No matter what industry you're in whatever you're passionate about, I find that that's what speaks to other people. So you can't change everything, right? So find a focus where you think you can make the most impact, Even if you're in the hospitality industry, do it with passion, treat every single person who comes through that door with the same level of respect and dignity that you treated the last. It's that simple. So, and just, yeah, do it with passion.
That's right. It's no matter what field we're in. If we're, Tricia, you said earlier too, again, drawing attention to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. If you're a social worker or working in child welfare, knowing the history of the profession, knowing the work, the impact of the work. That has the impact that it has had in furthering a lot of the injustices, and the same is true for law, right? I mean, Indigenous people weren't allowed to hire a lawyer for a long time, right? And until not that long ago. We have to know certainly and be aware of the injustices that our professions have committed upon entire peoples for some time, if we're truly to be able to do any kind of justice to the work that we want to do. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to ask folks if you have any questions to please put them. Otherwise, panelists, otherwise I'll just ask the panelists if you have anything else you want to add. So maybe take 30 seconds or so to gather your thoughts on what you might want to add in terms of some parting thoughts, while I continue talking to fill the time, to try and see if I can talk for 30 seconds and you can think of things to say in that time, and maybe somebody will type in a question before then. But otherwise, yeah, we can certainly wrap up a little early. There's a question in the chat. How do you talk about MRH and inspire others who haven't been through the amazing MRH experience? That's a great question. Thank you, Alicia. Who wants to take this question? Mallory, looks like you're about to say something, so I'm going to call on you.
Well, I guess sometimes it's having these moments of reflection, and how MRH has inspired your work, or making the connection from your MRH experience to your daily life. And it's applying what we've learned, but in our own personal circumstances. We've talked a lot about our professional work, but on the personal side, of course, this is also, MRH is so moving. It's really the motivation for me, and I think for many others as well. But I remember when I was working in this refugee camp, I had hired a Darfuri refugee as a tutor to help me learn Arabic, so I could better interact with the refugees. And this was still kind of like a personal engagement, but I was still trying to maintain this professional image of him in front of him. He was still a person of concern. And it was just a few days before going on leave. And I was really desperate to go home to Canada and see my family and my twin sister. I hadn't seen them in 6 months. And I was thinking, okay, all the family members, this is very useful vocabulary in Arabic. And then he suddenly froze and looked at me. And despite his usual insistence to speak Arabic, he said, "Why are you here? Like, why are you working at the Sudanese border? What is wrong with you?" And I thought, well, I'm here, I'm working on human rights and legal protection for refugees. And he just kind of shook his head and was like, "But you should be with your family." And I really hit me, and it was this instant jump to Pinhas's story of how he lost his twin sister. Also having a twin sister, this was really a part that hit me hard in the MRH program and the tours. But he had talked about how he lost his entire family, his friends, everything. And there was this connection immediately from Pinhas to the Darfuri refugee who had lost everything and was all alone in this camp. But that I remembered how Pinhas had eventually somehow, I think with his family, he'd found out what he had gone through and how he survived, and somehow managed to convince him to go back to Berlin and to stay in Hotel Adlon and like drink champagne and caviar and celebrate life. And sometimes I don't know if if Pinhas was joking or if he was serious about this, if it was just a dream that one day he would like to do, but or if he had actually done it. I don't remember now, but this is what is inspiring to me, is that we have to remember to enjoy our own lives. And you can't really communicate what MRH is like if you haven't done the program, all the preparations, the readings, the tour itself. But you can try to enjoy the way that others have inspired us to, and remember to take time for ourselves, to take time on our personal lives, because it is a field of work that is draining and difficult, and sometimes without much rewards or progress, or sometimes it takes 20 or 30 years to see, or generations to see the change. And it's just about sharing these experiences with others that we can hopefully tell them about the importance of the issues of human rights and justice.
Thank you, Mallory. That was such a great answer. It's so hard to communicate the MRH experience, and Alicia, that question is such a good one, because I think we all struggle to really explain what the impact was, because it's so personal and so emotional. And how do you explain the deep emotional friendships that you develop with the people that you've been hanging out with for maybe like a week and a half or two, and then your lifelong friends after that? Right? It's just such an intense experience. I want to give Rachel, Tricia, 30 seconds each if you have anything to add to this. I do want to give you some time to offer some concluding thoughts as well. So go ahead, Rachel.
I mean, that was again an amazing answer from Mallory, and I think I will just say that I think MRH, it is extremely difficult to explain to people, but it has, I think, made me more open, sharing my own background, for example. So there have been times working on this Talio case where I visited Bella Coola a number of times, and on one of those trips, I needed to talk to someone in a family about a very sensitive topic. I found there was a member of the family who he's an artist. He was actually in his totem pole carving studio working on that day. And so I met with him and we were starting to talk about, our different backgrounds. And when I shared with him some of my own background and that I was Jewish, his eyes kind of just lit up. And there was a common, for him, there was kind of a common understanding. And he was saying, well, you understand some of what we're going through then. And although, I don't think it's a good idea to compare trauma or compare things like that. But I think that it does give you a shared sense of, I get you in that way. And it seemed to be quite comforting. So for him, that's something that I've seen, a couple of occasions that really stand out for me. So I think MRH, if you can talk about it in even just sharing your own story, and your own background, that can really forge connections in itself.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a really poignant reflection, and what a great story. Thanks for sharing that. Tricia, do you have anything to add to this?
I think that you can experience aspects of MRH without participating in the program. And the example I'll give you is when I was involved in MRH, we were flying back. The trip was done. We had made our connections with people. And I sat next on the plane to a Muslim friend. And we literally talked the entire 9 hours back. And we had respectful conversations about our cultures. And we had the opportunity to ask the questions that we may have been too afraid to ask, questions that, like, sometimes you don't even know if the questions you're asking are insensitive, right? Sometimes that bias is really hard to recognize. But when you connect with somebody and you can actually have that meaningful conversation with them, without any pretense of feeling like no defensiveness, just pure openness. You can have that conversation with anybody. You don't have to be part of the MRH experience to do that. You just have to make an effort to want to learn and to want to know somebody. And that conversation on the way home really impacted me, and it will stay with me for the rest of my life. Because when we got back on top of this, and trying to learn more about him and knowing what a kind spirit he was, when we got back into Canada, he was detained at the airport for over an hour and a half. He didn't have a lawyer, I don't think, and it really impacted me, because we had just done this whole trip of, end racism, end hate, end bigotry, and then we get back to Canada, and my friend is detained because he looks Muslim. He has, his beard, his name being one of his names being Muhammad, and without rhyme or reason, he was detained. And this was like when I was in 2003. I was with MRH, so it was after the 2001 attacks. But just get to know people. You can do that anywhere.
Thanks, Tricia. That's a great story, and it's such an inspiring one too, about making just the ways we can connect with each other and have these meaningful experiences together. We are out of time, and I think I did want to give folks some time to offer some concluding thoughts, but I think those answers were pretty great concluding thoughts. So if the panelists are okay with it, I think we'll end it here. But before we do, I just want to say a quick thank you to the organizers of the panel, to Jason and Natasha, and to Carla, and I want to say thank you to the panelists for taking time to be here. Thanks to the folks who asked the great questions, and thank you to the folks who are rewatching this. Thanks for everybody for being here, first of all, today, and thanks to everybody who are rewatching this as a recorded video. So thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, or night, wherever you're watching from.
And thank you as well. Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.